Yeah. Okay. The session will be recorded and we will be putting up the video, the entire recorded variants and then snippets on YouTube so that parents can have access to specific portions of the recording. So first of all, we have with us two of our speech therapists from the team, Archana Marigoda and Ashrita. We have worked together now for almost a year, and I personally know and can vouch for how good they are with babies and children of various developmental disorders. And then we have with us Archana Sharma. She's an occupational therapist from Delhi. And she's been a part of our team, and she's brought a very wholesome understanding of how occupational therapy is meant to add value to a child's rehabilitation journey. Then we have with us Joshua Samuel. He's a co-physiotherapist. I know that he's very experienced in working with older children and very well versed with surgical and post-surgical rehab in developmental delay. We have with us Madhumita Bhattacharya. She's a clinical psychologist and also a dance movement therapist, and she brings her psychology background and her art-based therapy background to the panel and gives us ideas about what other alternative options are available for these children. We are waiting for one of our special educators to join the panel. And while we do the waiting, let me just walk you through a brief introduction of cerebral palsy. I'm not going to go into details. You can find this information everywhere, but more just to set a foundation for the panel discussion. So cerebral palsy has many definitions. You go to any source, you'll find a different definition, but predominantly all of them speak the same thing. It's a resultant of a non-progressive lesion. Basically, whatever damage has happened to the brain that has led to presentation of cerebral palsy, the damage is not going to get worsened with time. But what we see in terms of clinical presentation, that gets a little more obvious as the child starts learning new skills. So it is primarily a disorder which affects the child's posture, movement, balance, and coordination. Now, cerebral palsy, of course, also comes with other comorbidities. Many of the children, or rather most of the children, will have speech, feeding, and communication problems. Many of them can have comorbidities like epilepsy. Many of them can have vision problems. So there are a lot of comorbidities that exist in cerebral palsy due to the neurological lesion that presents itself. Now, having defined cerebral palsy, we need to know that the incidence of cerebral palsy, especially in India currently, is 3 per 1,000 live births. So every 3 children in 1,000 children currently are diagnosed to have cerebral palsy. And at any given point of time, we have approximately 25 lakh people with cerebral palsy living. So you can imagine the percentage of the disability and the challenge of the disorder. And there isn't enough awareness. Most parents don't know what access to therapies they can have. They have very limited knowledge about all the various resources that they can access to make their child's life better. So because of a very high and alarming incidence, and this incidence is high in most countries. So if you go by country by country incidence research, it is equally high. In the US, for instance, where the population is a fraction of what the population is in India, it is 2 per 1,000 live births, and that is quite a bit. And it's alarming in countries like Netherlands. Apparently, one cerebral palsy child is born every 22 hours. So we do have a very high percentage of cerebral palsy. There are a lot of causes we do know. Maternal causes. There are perinatal, that is before the birth, if the child has had any insult or deficiencies or infections, or during the birth process if there has been any oxygen deficit, or there is any damage to the brain during the process of birthing, it can lead to cerebral palsy. Sometimes even infections post-birth can lead to damage in the brain, which can present to cerebral palsy. So they are primarily the causes. So whatever the cause is, the damage occurs, and then what we see as cerebral palsy is basically the presentation, the delay in development, all the motor problems, all the speech problems, they all form a part of a sequelae. After talking about the incidence, I think when we talk about diagnosis, we are very specific about not labeling a child as cerebral palsy in most clinical fields. And that's because in the early 1-2 years, if we already label the child as cerebral palsy, then we don't think of alternative diagnosis that the child can probably have. The child can have another progressive condition that goes undetected because he's already being seen and treated as a cerebral palsy child. So most diagnostic scales talk about diagnosis and labeling the child as cerebral palsy at the age of 2. Of course, there is a lot of policy issues in other countries where unless you diagnose the child, you don't get access to insurance. In India, we don't have such a system, but since we follow the international diagnostic systems, we also don't call a child cerebral palsy until the age of 2. Sometimes the presentation is very mild. We don't even call them cerebral palsy till they are 5. And sometimes if the presentation is very severe, we know right at the 6th or the 7th month that this child is going to have cerebral palsy, but we wait it out and see how the progression goes. So that's all about diagnosis. Of course, a brief introduction on prognosis, that is the progress of the condition. All the research that we have read about prognosis talks about early intervention. If the child has access to intervention, prognosis is good. It is a lot better in first world countries where therapies are well defined, access is there. And of course, in poorer countries where you don't have access to resources, the disability often becomes deformity based. The child does not progress beyond some base milestones and gets into the whole mode of deformity. So that's a brief introduction of cerebral palsy as a condition. Of course, I am a practicing pediatric physiotherapist and I work in the early intervention phase. So a lot of my emphasis in the early years or early months of therapy is about identifying the abnormal motor patterns that is presenting because the child himself or herself does not do the right movement patterns. And it is our job to try and use these abnormal or control these abnormal patterns and encourage the child to do more and more, I think, correct motor patterns. So that is what we do from an early intervention perspective. Now, of course, once we diagnose a child as cerebral palsy, parents need to know a lot of things. And I feel that gap of who is going to tell the parent that these things are required, that's a very palpable gap, especially in the Indian society. And I think I would like to know from Madhumita, because she comes from the psychology background, what do you feel about what could be done better in this phase once you tell a parent that the child is going to have cerebral palsy or is showing signs of cerebral palsy?
Thank you, Priya, for the question, and thank you for inviting to this wonderful panel discussion. From my experience, what I have observed is, often whenever a child is showing signs of cerebral palsy and a doctor is giving a kind of diagnosis to the child that this could be a probable case of cerebral palsy. So what immediately follows for a parent is kind of a shock. And that they take a couple of steps back and get into a mode of sometimes into the guilt phase as to what did I do wrong, and what is going to be the child's future, and a lot of doubts and these kind of things emerge in their mind. Along with that, they don't have a clue a lot of times as to what this condition is. So the first step that I would say is, a support to the parent. The next step, very important step, would be psychoeducation, to let the parents understand that what is this disorder about, and what are the different kinds of things that we can actually expect. It could be just a physical the physical disability that they are going through. It could also be the speech related issues and the communication issues that they face in the future. And definitely there could be mental health issues as well, OT related issues. So fine motor activities related issues could be there. Education, academics could be an issue. So a a complete understanding for the parents that these could be probable things that the child may face, but then there is no definite thing, because a child with CP can have a high IQ as well, with just probably, they
No
have a
doubt.
stiff, muscle in the leg, and they might not be able to stretch their legs properly, but their intellectual functioning, their speech and all is absolutely fine. So the variability can be huge, what we usually see in CP cases. So for the parents, the first step is understanding the CP. The next step is definitely psychoeducation about the entire disorder,
Mm.
and what all we could expect. So once we know where the child is standing at this point of time, or what we can expect out of them, accordingly for the parents to understand what to expect and what to provide to the child. So these could be the first steps of, what you said as the gap. To fill in those gaps, these would be the first step, I would say.
Yes, I think many times many parents don't know at what stage we need to introduce certain therapies. Many parents don't even know that, say, one particular aspect of the rehab is done by somebody else. So I think those kind of wholesome education, it's something that we really need to address when you are already, you have discussed the possibility of diagnosing the child with CP. I think that should be the next possible step. Because many times if parents are not prepared for what comes next, it can be a little difficult to process that, okay, for this also therapy, for that also therapy. It's just that we need to understand that the whole point of therapy is to bring about certain dormant abilities that are not coming out on their own. So by having them stimulated, somebody can definitely help. So thank you for your input there. Um, so since we are talking about early intervention, I often do notice that the primary problem that a lot of children with cerebral palsy can face are issues with their mouth. It's about how they eat, how they are not able to eat, or swallowing problems, drooling, neck control because of all these issues. So Archana, if you could just shed some light on those topics for us.
Sure. Thank you for asking me that. Of course, when you start seeing issues with feeding, they start right at the point when you try to breastfeed your child. Okay. So if the issues have already existed at that age, then that is definitely going to show some changes in terms of there might be abnormal feeding patterns. The child might not be latching onto the nipple. There are such things that come out as presentations. Of course, you can also see feeding issues in most children with cerebral palsy, according to data. And it is a cause of concern, and that has to be addressed, because we all know that we use our mouths for not just feeding, we also use it for speech. So when you see feeding issues initially, you should in a way understand that this is going to result in a speech problem as well. Okay, so feeding issues have to be addressed from the get-go, and how they present themselves is like, it can be dependent on various presentations of CP. Again, it could be hypotonia at certain areas of the pharynx, the laryngeal areas. It could be, like you said, drooling because of inadequate lip closure. There could be problems with even chewing certain mashed solids. So what happens is there are certain strategies that you can use, like either diet modification. You can use certain equipments that will help the child to feed in a certain position. Of course, positioning the child in a certain way also ensures that the feeding and all of that is happening. But I'd like to highlight here that we need to get a dietitian on board. We need to get a lot of other professionals on board when making this decision, because the most important thing for a child initially would be nutrition.
Yes.
If nutrition needs are not being met, then you will not be worried about speech and occupational therapy and all of that at that point. So when a dietitian rules out that this child needs this particular amount of food and this child has to gain so much weight in so many months, and that is not happening, that's when you should be worried. Okay, when you see long meal times, when you see very stressful meal times, when you see children not gaining weight, that's when you know that your child has a feeding or a swallowing disorder. And they tend to overlap in children with cerebral palsy because, feeding involves swallowing, of course, but feeding is more to do with the oromotor movements that happens with oral preparation of the food. Okay, swallowing is much, much later that happens, and both can co-occur. Some may just be an issue with lip closure and drooling and all of that. But ultimately, they all need to be addressed at the very beginning when the parents have these stressful meal times with children. Okay, and like I was telling you, when these issues occur, there are chances that these children, quite a huge number of the children with cerebral palsy actually have respiratory issues associated with feeding, and they kind of contribute to each other. So when aspiration keeps happening constantly, then it can lead to pneumonia. It can lead to when there is a lot of tightness because of spasticity, and there could be constipation that is happening. Okay, and there could also be this regurgitation, which leads to GERD, right? Gastroenterous, like all these reflux disorders that we see. So one can lead to the other. So which is why it becomes important to identify these things very, very early, and that can be as young as when the child has just started breastfeeding, and much older also when you know that your child is unable to masticate and swallow foods. So, yeah, definitely this is something that we'll have to look at a very early stage and intervene with.
What do you have to say about, say, feeding chairs and, say, ensuring neck position? And say, many children have a lot of resistance towards, say, thicker consistency of food. And parents, I do understand these are difficult meal times most of the time. So it's easier to meet the nutritional requirement of the child and, give them slightly blended foods, which does not challenge their oromotor abilities much. So you think all of this can be taken into consideration?
They should be. In fact, that's why we need a team intervention when it comes to
Right.
any disorder for that matter, not just cerebral palsy, because there's a neurological involvement there and that cannot ever be ignored. And seating positions, like I said, definitely when there are studies that say that when the trunk stability improves, the feeding disorder also reduces in terms of its severity. And of course, you'll have to balance this thing with when you have a discussion with a parent, you need to sit with the dietitian, you need to sit with the physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, and maybe a psychologist, also can be a part of that discussion depending on the needs of the child. That is when you make this decision as to how intensive and how what are the strategies that you're going to use. Some children will do well with just therapies like oral placement therapy, where we use tools to get the children to work on their oromotor, muscle strength, and stability of the jaw and endurance of whatever activity that they're doing. But some children may require alternative, things like I said, diet modification, because the nutrition requirements are high. And right now the child is unable to, do the feeding for himself or herself. Right. So all of these factors need to be taken into consideration when you come up with a therapy plan.
It really is something that I do face a lot in clinical practice, right? I handle babies as young as, say, 3 months, 2 months, and sometimes in early intervention, many mothers do report latching problems, and it sort of starts from there. One problem leads to the other, and then it's just difficulties after every stage of feeding. What is supposed to be introduced at 4th month doesn't happen till 6th, 7th month. What solid foods are supposed to be started by 6th month. Many times children are not able to take it even until the age of 1 year. So I do see that, and then eventually I do see that speech movements are also getting delayed. So I do see the pattern there.
I'd also add that this is not just a motor issue. These children can present sensory issues as well.
Right.
And of course, we'll have to look at those aspects in terms of the kind of foods we feed also. Some children with, sensory challenges may be okay with putting other things in the mouth and exploring, but they may have difficulty managing bolus, okay? And it works the other way around when there are no sensory challenges overlapping and it's mostly the motor deficits that are presenting. So that definitely, adds, you need to look into that as well when you work, because we know that these cranial nerves that supply the oral motor system, they are both sensory and motor.
Right.
So when they go together and they help us, understand how to chew food or how to take it inside, both of them need to be worked upon.
Right.
Yes.
Coming from the sensory, since you've provided me that link, I wanted to actually address Archana Sharma. Not just about the sensory, maybe in the initial stage, right? When a lot of parents probably don't know when to approach occupational therapy as a therapy for their child. I wanted to know, to be honest, like in the early intervention stage, when we are looking at hand function and eye-hand coordination and visual-motor challenges. What is your opinion on when should intervention start, and generally, like, what is your experience with early intervention?
Thank you, Priya. See, when we talk about early intervention, so it involves, why do you think that it is so important to engage a child in early intervention? Because obviously we all know that there is a term known as neuroplasticity, right? That there is something happening in the brain and it is happening at a faster rate in a kid's brain rather than an adult's brain. Obviously, we all know that. So obviously in terms of early intervention, it is important to start physiotherapy, occupational therapy, I will even say speech therapy, as early as a parent understand that there is a deficit that is present, or maybe they visit a doctor and doctor says maybe there is an issue with your child. Okay, as soon as they understand that there is a deficit, any kind of deficit, they have to get in touch with the therapist, let it be physiotherapist, occupational therapist, or speech therapist, or for that matter any other therapist that they know, so that the particular therapist can actually refer them to different professionals as required. So yes, so I'll come back to the neuroplasticity thing. So what happens in case of neuroplasticity, if we don't intervene early, right, so our brain is continuously developing, it's growing, and child is learning abnormal patterns of movement, he's getting abnormal feedback from his joints or muscles, and obviously his brain is learning that abnormal pattern.
That's right.
Yes. So if that is happening in terms of his motor development, same thing is happening in terms of his sensory development as well. Everything is associated, nothing, we can't separate it out. Even if we talk about speech therapy, our head, neck, trunk, upper whole body, our hand, shoulder, everything is associated. We cannot just divide. Okay, I have a child, okay, my doctor says that there is a problem in terms of achieving his developmental milestones, so I'll wait until he starts walking, and then maybe I'll start working on his sensory issues, or maybe then I'll start working on his speech or feeding issues. I have a child whose mother actually thinks this way. She thinks that maybe my priority or primary goal is walking, making my child walk. So until she starts walking, I won't move on to speech. So I know I tried counseling her, but after a point, I cannot do anything about it, because that is how they think. But obviously, we need to keep counseling parents and telling them that, the brain is developing at a particular, it develops at a faster rate till a particular age, maybe 7 to 8 years. You have less time, and, you need to work as fast as possible.
Right.
Okay. So that was for starting the intervention as early as possible. And what kind of issues I would like to specify here, we all see in a child when, even if you get a child and you don't know if I need to refer it for OT at this age, maybe for 6 months old or maybe 7 to 8 months old child, do I need to refer or not? So I would say yes, because you might have seen parents coming up with problems like, I see my child, being lazy or sleepy most of the time. So
Hmm.
what is that? That is mostly his arousal issues.
Arousal, yeah.
Yes, and associated with sensory. Then we say at times that maybe my child is able to sit, but he's not doing anything with his hands. Or maybe he's able to sit, but he falls down again. So
Right.
what is it? He's not getting the right feedback from his joints yet. Proprioceptive issues. Okay. Again, tactile issues. He's not able to hold the object. And just not that, he's trying to use his hands to stabilize himself first. There's a combination again. We need to work together. So he's trying to use his hands to stabilize himself. Once he'll be able to do that, then the next step comes is holding an object in his hand. So obviously, again, we need to work together in this step as well. So obviously, there are sensory issues associated with kids. Their hand is always, fisted. So obviously, tactile defensiveness
Defensiveness.
big issue that we can see as early as like maybe 6 months of age. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we need to refer them as early as possible. And we all need to also understand that CP is not just a motor, problem. So it is sensory-based motor planning
Motor
issues.
problems, right.
We can call it that. So what happens? Obviously, I have a low tone. For example, I'm just saying a child has low tone. He's not able to, his brain is not getting appropriate stimulation or maybe feedback through his, again, muscles and joints. So what happens? He won't be able to plan his actions accordingly, right? Because it could be just his strength as well. I don't have enough shoulder strength. I'm not able to lift my hand up to reach for an object. But it could also be that I'm not able to, judge how much, pressure I'm supposed to apply, or how far is my toy. I'm not able to judge that. Eye hand coordination, visual perceptual issues, we actually miss these often. So what happens, these parents actually need to understand what these issues are.
Right.
For example, it is not just okay, I'll say it is a combination of vision and perception.
Right.
Okay, so vision is again associated with our head movements. So we need to, control a child's head movement to actually help him to see an object appropriately, right? And then perceive the object. For example, I don't know how to tie, button my shirt if I won't understand where the button is or where the loop for the button is. All these things, even for handwriting, for holding an object, scooping food in the spoon, all these things require visual perception, perceptual abilities.
Right.
How much depth my I'm walking, but I don't understand how much depth my staircase has, or how I'm supposed to keep my step. All these
It's about the
problems.
judgment of motor planning. Right.
Yes. So all these things are motor and sensory.
Right.
So we need to address them together. So as soon as you get a child with motor issues, you actually have to do an assessment for sensory as well. As early as you'll be able to find these sensory issues along with motor issues, you'll be able to treat these deficits, whatever you see in a child, better. Because there are sensory strategies that can help you to, I won't say completely improve, but maybe normalize a child's
The
tone to some
responses
extent.
also. Right.
Yes.
No,
Then
I
there
think
are
from an experience point of view, right? It's almost been a decade in clinical practice, and I think it's only in the last 1 or 2 years that I've really understood, even I, having been in the field for so long, how having an OT in the team can change the child's response to physiotherapy. Like for me, that knowledge. So for someone who's from the field, if this awareness has come or taken its own time to develop, so you can imagine for a parent who's told, okay, your child has movement issues, he'll need physiotherapy, speech issues, speech therapy, So the whole idea of, I would say, so many interventions that need to happen on the child can be a little overwhelming. And I think, Archana Marigoda, I mean, you should probably in the end of the discussion just try and sort of summarize this dilemma, because parents would always, of course, want to give whatever is accessible. But it is true that I still don't know like a good OT I can refer my children to. So it's a city problem. Like I'm in Bangalore and I don't know someone like I think can handle children. So I feel resources are also very important. So I think we need to also come up with say very effective home program based methodology, so that our outreach is a little more. So when so many of us panelists come together, I always feel like, imagine the child having to come to each one of us for some intervention. So
Yeah.
I think the cumulative cost of therapy, and it's a very realistic thing, we can't ignore that, because each one of us works in a particular, with one particular goal in our minds, and it's a very realistic thing. So maybe by the end of the discussion, we could probably have like a small discussion on that. Joshua, you have anything to add on that?
So, yeah, so same what you had mentioned, right? So much of the problems is related to accessibility.
Can you be a little louder, Joshua?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, slightly better, louder.
Yes. So much of the problem is related to the availability and accessibility.
Yes.
On one side, where the resources are very less, on the other side, where we have the resources, but the patients are unable to go for it because they are not having proper knowledge and understanding. So that's one part of the thing that we need to work on, where we raise awareness for the parents and the general public, like these kind of problems need to be addressed with specialty for people, and that needs to be made available so that they can avail it at a cost-effective manner. I think one of the parents has put the group chat as well, right?
Right.
So because obviously it's going to be taxing for them to do finances, okay, and there should be some solutions that will come out, okay, either through some private organization or governmental organization, where it comes that they can cover some of the expenses related to financial issues. So there are different challenges, but by that result, there will be a way. So we still can work towards it.
Yes. So having addressed visuomotor and speech, and I think feeding, the most important next stage of a child's development happens to be speech. Now, this is something that even I am always confused with. When a parent asks me in the first year of life, okay, whether I should take my child for speech therapy. And here I'm not talking about a child who has visual oromotor issue, where I can see the child struggling. If they ask me at within the age of 1, whether the child is ready for speech therapy, I'm usually not sure of whether I should say yes or no in terms of the speech therapy aspect. So and since most of the time in that phase physio is very intensive, I do feel a pang of guilt saying, yeah, you probably have to say, so I try to see if my motor goals can be achieved fast, and then I can refer. And it's a very natural clinical instinct, to be honest, because we work with parents over many months, we develop a bond with them, and we try to make sure that certain empathy is given to their considerations also, right? They have to make time and all of that. So Ashrita, if a parent asks me, say at 9 months, should I take my child for therapy? What should be my approach towards this? And what is your opinion on how it should be dealt with?
That's a very interesting question, Priya. So, see, I would never say no for early intervention. It could be 6 months, it could be 9 months, it could be as early as, even 1 year, people even hesitate to take them for speech therapy. So I would say yes, if you're giving me a timeline of 9 months, because they can be so much established even at the age of 9 months. Okay. And usually the younger the age, we speech therapists usually start off with play. So something, the first step that we do in play is connect with the child. As much as we can, we connect with the child. We form a bond with the child. Okay. And during
Which
this
we
time,
physios struggle with so badly. All our kids hate us.
yeah, that's a tough task. We understand that as well. Yeah. So what happens is during this time is where the child responds to as many stimuli as much as possible. It could be through tactile, example like water play. Okay, it could be through a visual, lot of lights. Okay, a lot of colors. Okay, it could also be through a lot of audio, so a lot of rhymes or a lot of intonation plates, a lot of, and also something that many people miss out during this time is people play. So a lot of kids love people play. Example would be like peekaboo, just very simple, extremely simple game, but it could stimulate the child in so many ways as much as possible. Okay, peekaboo, hiding things. Okay, then crawling. If the child is at the crawling age, you crawl with the child. Okay, so there are a lot of ways where we establish play with the child. So one of them would be through people game. One of them would be through sensory play, like how Archana mentioned. Okay, that the more stimuli the child gets from the environment, the more his brain is taking in, and the more stronger it is getting
Right.
at that point. And through this, we also establish a few, occupational therapists. They have these goals of eye contact, response to, the name call, okay, response to any sort of stimuli. Then it also regulates a lot of emotions in the child play. So the child tends to judge with your tone if you're angry, with your expressions, if you're sad or you're happy, the way you squeal, the way you shout, all these, they might sound very silly, but they play a huge role in the child's development and the way you establish a bond with the child. And also what is happening nowadays, it's not just parents with children who have cerebral palsy, but as many communication disorders as possible, they have a lot of difficulty establishing a bond with their child.
Right.
Okay, they do not know how to
play with the
play
child.
with their child.
Yes, yes.
Okay, it has come to that stage where we have to even train the parents, and and tell them. And after the what do you say, after they follow the tips, they're so happy to see the changes in their children, the kind of connect they have with their children, and the responses that their children give.
Right.
So I would say play is extremely important, however early. And even if you bring your child at the age of 5 or 4, we still start off with play. No matter what, we still start off with play. It is that important in a child's life.
Right.
And the second thing that comes along with play is socialization that comes with play. Okay, this might not apply at a very young age, maybe, but you should start as early as 1.5 years. It is extremely important. So the child is exposed to as many social situations as possible, and the child hears as much speech as possible through, adults, through other children talking and playing. So when they see these things happening, when they observe these things happening, their imitation skills improve. Okay, their observation skills improve. So these were the most important aspects which we would start working on with however old the child, which is very important. And these are these are the baseline goals that speech therapists have.
So if a parent can find time and afford it, we should say yes to speech therapy, no matter what the age is. That would
Yes.
be.
Yes.
In fact, I wanted to continue talking about some more things that I wanted to add to this is play therapy also is a window into a child's thinking. At whatever stage, right? The kind of stimulus you give, like Ashruta mentioned, how they respond to something is what tells you about how they think, how do they look at objects, how do they look at people, how do they respond to their name call or anything for that matter, right? And it is also an opportunity for us to enter their world when they are not motivated enough to form that bond yet. Okay, so early in stimulation will have various other strategies that are age appropriate, like Ashruta mentioned. But like she said, play therapy is the way to form that bond with children and also make them understand that it is exciting to talk to others. It is exciting to be a part of a group. It is wonderful to form those bonds with people and, be more social. So that definitely is why I think play therapy works, and we both are play therapy advocates. So
Yes.
we totally agree to that.
Play therapy for,
So is
I think,
Madhu.
physiotherapists is a luxury. Like, I wish I could spend 5 minutes every session, just playing. Sometimes we don't get that much time. Yes, Joshua.
So Ashrita and Archana, okay. So what I was thinking is, so some of the children, okay, they do have their siblings. Okay. So I frequently come across children like
Joshua, sorry to interrupt.
for,
Could you be a
can
bit
you hear me?
louder? Sorry,
Now,
you're
can you
unable
hear
to.
me?
It's not
We can
clear.
hear you, but
Now
it's
can
a
you
bit
hear me?
muffled. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's as if you're speaking from somewhere far away.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I was asking is, so if the child has a sibling, okay, who is a typically developing child, okay, so how could this play therapy or the play between the siblings can help the child's development? Okay, because this might be
We're not able to hear you, Joshua. Can you take your earphones off if that's okay?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, so much.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So what I was asking is, so if the children, okay, so whom we are treating has a sibling, is a typically developing child, okay, how could this play be used with them, or do we also take into consideration the typically developing child of how to be able to play with his younger sibling or elder sibling? What can be done with? Can some light be thrown on this?
I think I'm just clarifying, he's talking about involving a typically developing sibling in the house, in the child, and, trying to get the most out of their interactions in terms of play therapy.
Yeah.
Okay. Ashrita, would you like to answer it? Madhumita also wants to answer. Okay, we'll all take turns. Ashrita, you go first. Madhumita can go next, and then I'll go.
Sure. So, you're asking me if there's a typically developing child and a child with a communication disability.
So how
being in
to,
the
I
same
think,
or cerebral
establish
palsy in particular.
interactions.
I mean, just interaction, is it?
Right.
Okay. So we can use, we can, sorry to use that word. We can actually use that opportunity to get a lot of social skills involved with the child. Okay, the first thing. And a lot of modeling is one of the strategies that we use, imitation or modeling that we use. So the child who's having a difficulty can actually mirror a certain communication base, can mirror certain behaviors. I mean, in terms of communication, okay, can also imitate their speech. So we can use a lot of these, any sort of interactive games, any sort of even regular things such as helping out in the household chores. Okay, so these kind of opportunities we can use with both of them being there parallelly, while the child who has a difficulty will get a chance to see how it is done or how it is spoken. So we usually want the child to learn through a typically developing child. Archana or Madhumita, do you guys want to add?
Madhumita, go ahead.
Yeah. So I would like to add to what Archana and Arshada had said earlier. So play therapy, so even as psychologists, we would use a lot of play therapy with kids who have developmental issues, right? So along with what both of you have said, that it becomes a very important aspect of developing the communication. The thing that I would like to add here is it is also a very, very important way for expressing themselves. So it's not just about learning new things, but also whatever is going on in their mind. Play is a very, very important thing to express those things, right? From, a typically growing child who starts playing from a very, very early age. Different kinds of play, just looking at the facial expressions and laughing out loud. So even that, they are verbalizing a lot of these things. So during play therapy, a lot of these expressions would also develop, because the kids with cerebral palsy, because of the spasticity, which can also happen in their facial region, they're not being able to express their emotions as well, be it love, be it any other emotion. So those kind of things can also be developed through play therapy. So expression can play a very, very major role in that aspect as well.
Yeah. Go ahead, Archana.
I feel not just for socializing, Joshua, even we can use an elder or younger sibling, typically developing child during our therapy as well. You know, if a child comes to you, to your center with the client or with their sibling, you can actually involve them together in the play, in the activity that you want them to do. For example, we often use, balls, gym balls, other things, or child doesn't understand what he's supposed to do, or he's so reluctant or, anxious because we are so cruel to him because of our,
Handling.
aggressive therapies and handling, obviously.
Yes.
So, this gives them a sense of comfort. And they feel that maybe it is something more like play rather than exercise. Because when they come to us, they are like, okay, we have to go for exercise. The term itself creates some kind of fear in their head, even if they don't understand it. They know something, exercising is something that, should not be done. It is scary. It is
I think some
painful.
of the associative behaviors are so strong, and that eventually leads to very strong resistance, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So
So we can also use play therapy, or if not play therapy so much, then we use a combination, obviously, of exercise and play therapy. But in your case, also
OTs
you
have a
can.
lot of fun. Okay, I'm going to just put it out there. We are the sad ones here.
I also want to add something here. I would ask parents to exercise caution, even therapists, because it's a funny story. I have a child coming in who has an older sibling, who is quite what do you say, roaming around all the time and wouldn't sit in a place. But he is brought into therapy, and it has sort of, I have understood that younger siblings mimic their older siblings to the extent that they even try to copy their simplest of movements. Okay, so I mean, you have to exercise caution here as parents and therapists as to what is the child
Aspect
picking
of,
up.
yeah, what
Yes.
aspect of their behavior you want the child
Yes,
with issues
absolutely,
to mimic.
absolutely. And like everybody mentioned about how play therapy helps and all of that. And Joshua's question was about how a sibling can contribute. Another thing that has to be worked upon here is, another example that I'd like to give you is, one of the younger siblings that I work with who has autism, actually, her older sibling, she is neurotypical. Okay, so what happens with this child is she becomes very upset when the older sibling is able to do things and she is not able to. She's not ready to accept that. Okay, so you will also have to understand how to make that person or that sibling a part of the learning process, and what kind of needs to be calibrated when you involve them. I feel that is a decision that has to be made with a lot of information. Go
So
ahead.
that's what the basis of my question is. Okay. Because many times we get some children, right, who are like very high performing sibling. Okay. So many times they are like kept away and everything. So what? So in this point, right? So what?
Yeah.
Maybe is there any? I know that play cannot be predetermined to an extent. Okay, but any games or any play we can have for the sibling. Okay, which is like kind of, it's not overly motor dependent, or less like what Ashta was telling, something like a peekaboo or something. Okay, it doesn't require much of motor movements from the kids to be done. Okay, something like that, if it's already available, or if the framework of the play what you're going to give to the child, is it like instantly it comes to the therapist, or do we have certain types of play? For example, this group of patients we give this, or this pattern of children we give this. Is there any predetermined play activities are there, or is it just to practice? I think it's to practice, right?
think with a few kids where I have used the sibling when they accompany them for therapy, right? I make typically the older sibling, do all that I would have made the parent do. So for instance, if we are putting the rings, the older sibling can hold the rod and this child can attempt. So like involve the older sibling who's accompanying the child for therapy in a way that you would have probably involved the parent. And probably the bonding and the response might be slightly better because they don't see this as two adults working on the child. They see it as another child becoming a part. So this does work. Like I have used this on a few of my slightly older difficult children, where compliance is a problem, that if the sibling is able to come for therapy, we have excellent sessions. So I think predetermined might be difficult, but whatever you would have wanted the parent to do, maybe this sibling, the neurotypical sibling, could do. And you can just have a more enriching, and this can be then replicated by the parent at home, because now the parent has seen how or what is it that they are expected to do in the house. They would be able to choreograph a better therapy session for the child in the house.
Because it gels well and it goes on well. Okay, because the other sibling is going to be at the home throughout the day. Okay?
Yes.
So both of them can become good partners, and that
Yes.
play can
Maybe,
be carried.
maybe it will enhance therapy goals also.
And it also
Because
helps, and it also helps to, when you do your initial assessment with a family, to understand what kind of things are being done. So I usually get parents to send me videos. I monitor through videos as to how they are interacting, how the sibling is interacting, what kind of stimuli the child is liking. So it is never predetermined, Joshua.
Right.
At least with our play therapy sessions, I think it's with most play therapy sessions, right? It's never predetermined. You just know certain things that the child will be attracted to and will have a lot of engagement with, and you try to get the other sibling. I sort of do this where, sometimes I say that to the older sibling that, I'm only going to talk to you because the younger one is being adamant or doesn't want to. So the younger one, it might be a scenario where the younger one wants that attention, and that's why he or she is motivated and, does the activity or says a certain thing. So these are some things that you'll have to calibrate, and it has to be tailor-made for each child that you see.
Absolutely. Yes, and I would like to also add here that definitely it has to be tailor-made, and sometimes for each session, it could be different.
Yes.
On top of that, involving the sibling can also be advantageous in terms of developing the bond between the siblings, because sometimes a typically developing child would not be, involved so much with the other sibling, spending so much of time and interacting with the child. So automatically the child also feels, a child with CP might feel left out a lot of times. So these, situations can be utilized to develop the bond between the parents, between the sibling as well. And also if there are, other kids in the, surrounding with whom we can involve some small play sessions kind of things, those can also develop in the social interaction, developmental stages as well.
So that's true.
This was fascinating actually for the whole play therapy led discussion. I'm going to actually ask Joshua a few things about, say, older children, because you have handled a lot of, I think, GMFCS 3, 4, 5, those kids, and you have handled them pre-surgery, post-surgery, and you are very well versed with surgical interventions that's often done. So from that perspective, because I do realize that awareness about those procedures are also very poor. So
Yes,
can you
correct.
just highlight a few things?
So when we talk about older children, okay, so when you were explaining, I think you mentioned a few things about GMFCS. So GMFCS is nothing but what we do the classification for children. Okay. So from ages from 1 to 5. So 5 is considered as a child who is having very severe difficulty. 1 is child with a very least severity. Okay. So when we talk about surgical intervention for the children, okay. So majorly the major surgical intervention, what we do is to correct the hip dislocations. Okay. So all the research or most of the published literature, what it says is about 35%, okay, of children with mostly spastic and dystonic cerebral palsy can have hip displacement. Okay, among about 35 to 40%, almost about 15 to 20% will definitely have a hip dislocation. Okay, which is at an alarming stage. Now, why this hip dislocation is very important is because hip is one of the key structures which makes the child to sit and everything, all the other activities to make the children make the child in a more upright position. So slowly, when the hip is out of place, okay, it causes a lot of difficulty in functioning for the child, especially the day-to-day activities like be it like putting on the pants, picking up the pants, or going to the toilet. Or a lot of things are getting difficult for the child to do, and for the caregiver as well. Okay, for the parents also it gets a lot of difficulty. Okay, and over that it will cause pain. Okay, so all these things will again cause the child a lot of negative impact on his or her development. Okay, so this needs to be intervened at an earlier stage so that the hip is not to be dislocated. Okay, so now how this hip dislocation can be identified is we usually take the simple thing is like taking an X-ray of the hip. Okay, we call this as migration index. Okay, migration index is nothing but how much the head of the thigh bone is inside the hip bone. Okay, so the hip is connected to the thigh. So if the hip bone is out of the thigh bone, okay, it doesn't come out straight away. It comes out slowly as the child's development is not happening, or as the child's muscle tightness is getting progress, etc., etc. So this hip slowly starts to come out. Many times it's mostly one of the leg. Okay, not very rarely it can be both the legs also. Okay, so we need to be very watchful of it. So once in every 6 months or 1 year is generally advised as per the literature published to see how the hip is set in place or not. Okay, so there are certain things what a parent can able to identify, like if the hip is going out of place. One is the position of the child. Okay, usually the legs which would be going on to one particular side. Okay, and if child can exhibit pain or cry for unknown reasons, or if you move that particular part or the joint or something, the pain can also aggravate. Okay, so these are things. Now coming to the intervention part of it. Okay. So first is to prevent this from dislocating. We have a lot of positioning techniques and other exercises and proper chair, etc. All those things matters. Okay, so if it is beyond 50% or 70% of the hip is out, okay, of the thigh bone is out of the hip, then surgery is the only preferred option. Okay, so the surgery basically is done to put the hip back in place. Okay, so once the hip is put back in place, biomechanically the alignment are done better. Okay, but still the child's development needs to come from the brain based on the exercises or other activities or play, whatever they're doing to the child. Okay, so hip dislocation or hip problems related to it, okay, can be a hindrance to the child's development. Okay, so addressing it or monitoring it parallelly along with other issues also makes a world of difference for the child. Okay, because once the pain starts to come at the hip, then the child may not be cooperating with any other activities or other.
And I think currently, I think universally the principle is that after the age of 2,
Yes.
if the child is showing very visible asymmetries, or if the child is not walking yet, it is very important that depending on the severity, we repeat hip x-rays every 6 months.
Every 6 months.
Because the changes in the alignment of the hip can happen very rapidly based on the growth spurts of the child. Like as the child gains height.
If you have the child like GMX is 4 or 5, then the higher chances of the hip getting dislocated is also being done.
Yes.
So it's good to diagnose it or good to monitor it at an earlier stage so that the hip is kept in place. Okay? Because surgery has its own pros and cons.
Right.
It's good to have the good post-surgical rehabilitation as well for the child, so that whatever the correction has been done has to be maintained.
I think in general, pediatric surgery means it always puts, like I am still convincing an 8-year-old cerebral palsy child under my care. I'm still convincing the parents that here on therapy alone is not going to help. We need to provide. So I think there is a lot of general apprehension about interventions. And I feel again, probably not knowing enough and not being told at the right age, and that this could really benefit. So again, I think it's all about I think the whole communication around cerebral palsy, right? I do feel that a lot of GMFCS 4 and 5, they are the severe categories, right? We can actually, if effectively moderated, we can bring them down to 3 and, give them a relatively complication-free life if we are able to use all the resources that we have at the right age. Sometimes even a simple intervention like getting Botox done for the calf muscle, which can relax it for a few months, giving us the window to work on the child. Sometimes that resistance we find. So of course, again, this piece of information should be conveyed to the parents from the medical team. So therein you need a very good communication channel going with your child's neurologist and your child's orthopedic surgeon. So I think, again, we are again talking about multidisciplinary interventions.
The decision
So
making comes into the
yes,
play.
yes,
Correct.
yes.
There are a lot of factors, and yes, but knowing this or being aware about all these problems now will help the parents take a better decision of it.
Right.
Because as such, once after the surgery, everything is not done. Okay, so still the follow up and everything needs to be done for a longer period of time, either it be therapy or etc.
True. Of course, with older children, apart from surgery, we are also talking about some very difficult things here, like the possibility of giving a child a wheelchair sometimes. There again, there is, because our society is the way it is, it's very image conscious. It's very hard to convince that, I don't think this child is going to walk, so let's work for wheelchair mobility, and that automatically meets with a lot of resistance, because the emphasis shifts from making the child independent to the fact that the child becomes a wheelchair child. So I think these are some difficult questions that older cerebral palsy children do end up, or the parents do end up having to face. Apart from wheelchair, I think some high level orthotic supports, where some children might need or like supports from the exterior all the way going up till their hip and sometimes even the trunk, to just get a little bit of better alignment, which can enable them to probably move better. So I think there are so many angles to cerebral palsy as the child progresses from one motor stage to the other, that it's important that the parent is given this information in the forms of clinical stories or the forms of access to resources that's available to them in whichever city that they are. So I think since we work with parents very close, and over a period of time, like I have children who've been with me 6 years, 7 years, and children are practically family now. I think when you become such an integral part of this child's life, it's very important that you have a very important say in these kind of decisions. And it's not about the social issue, it's not about the image, it's not about the stigma. And I think it's such a, for us, like a lot of us, at least I don't know about you guys, but I know that a lot of the times I'm very driven, because a lot of parents tell me, okay, they are asking when the child is going to walk. So it always and that bothers a lot, and it's not a wrong thing. It's just how the society is priming all of us to think, right? We're always thinking about what others are thinking about our child. So I think in terms of cerebral palsy awareness, that angle also has to be highlighted quite a bit. So I think that's where inclusion comes into picture. So I was going to ask you, Madhumita, like, what is your opinion on this?
Right. Archana wanted to say something. Before
Yes,
that?
I wanted to just add to Joshua's point here. That's it,
Mm.
related to surgical intervention. Since I was
Mhm.
working in a hospital earlier, so I've worked in a PMR department. So I just wanted to add few things or possibilities available. So apart from hip surgeries, there are, what happens at times, parents, they don't know that some preparatory activities are to be done at home. For example, they've not or they have not taken appropriate physiotherapy sessions earlier. So there are high chances that kids might end up having some tightness leading to deformities in ankles or maybe knees. So there are options available. For example, we have worked so much with kids of not children with 11 years of age or 16 years of age. So we start with conservative management along with doctors. So it is just simple casting or maybe some injections, alcohol injections, Botox, something or the other. And if we are able to attain appropriate range to make the child walk, okay, with the cast on, then we do not go for surgeries. But in case of severe spastic cases, we actually have seen doctors doing TA elongation or maybe hamstrings elongation surgeries. And after that, but these surgeries are not enough on, just
On
the
their
surgery.
own. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Enough on
It's not a fix all.
Yes, but after that, using KAFOs, as Priya you mentioned earlier, and then doing therapies or training them to walk, gait training and everything, that helps, and you can actually make a child walk. So I've seen kids, I don't know, maybe not all of them, but even if they are not able to walk by the age of 10 or 12, there are possibilities, there are some hopes available. So you
Right,
should not
right.
just give in and say that there is nothing available.
True,
You
true,
should think of these possibilities as well.
true.
And it is not, surgery takes just a day or two, second day under observation, third day you have to make the child
Make the
stand.
child
I'm
mobile.
telling you,
True,
yes.
true, true. Yes.
So it is very effective.
Hmm,
So I think if you know someone like this, you should pass on this word and tell them that this is not the end.
hmm.
Keep moving.
Absolutely. This has been a place for all of us to learn and coagulate the information that each of us have. So thank you for that.
Okay, yes, Madhumita.
Yeah. So yeah, your
Thank you.
questions. So how
Yeah,
to
I was
be-
talking about inclusion, and I just like making these children feel like, it's fine. Like,
Right. So I mean, recently, like maybe a week or two back, I just attended a workshop which was on the topic of, redefining the inclusion, redefining disability all over the world. So even the World Health Organization is presently thinking on how to redefine disability. Is disability really about, the child not being able to do something, or we as, capable individuals who are capable of moving around, we are creating the disability for them. So say for example, like a child who is on a wheelchair, right? The person, the child may not have a difficulty going inside a building if we, make the structure of the building in such a way that the
Accessible.
wheelchair can actually go inside. So
Yeah.
in that case, there is no disability for them at all. They
Yeah.
have some limitations, physical limitations, but the disability in that sense is created by us. So coming back to the stigmas and, the inclusions and all, if we are really looking forward to, make those inclusions of children with CP or any other developmental disorders for that matter, we really need to think about, shifting and shuffling things that are already there around so that we can help these kids or help these people with disabilities live a independent life in whatsoever possibilities that is there. So a child who has a proper intellectual capacity, but because of the physical disability, they are on a wheelchair and they cannot access a building, hence they cannot go inside a workspace and they can't work. In that respect, it is we who have created the difficulty for them. They did not create the difficulty. So we really need to think about the entire situation. And a lot of these things are being thought now. Even the World Health Organization, as I said, is thinking on these aspects and what all things needs to be there as rights for these people, is taken care of. So inclusion absolutely needs to be taken care of. And the first step for that would be the parents accepting the child's condition.
Absolutely.
So yes, the child has a difficulty. It is a difficult thing to, accept. The first year, yes, it is very difficult, but slowly the child, again, so when in my clinical practice, when I was working in the rehabilitation center where we used to deal with kids with cerebral palsy, a lot of parents during the parental counseling pre-surgery. Okay, so I would do the parental counseling pre-surgery. So they would come back and ask me that, ma'am, like once the surgery is done, a few months of therapy is done to the child, is my child going to come back absolutely normal? So as much as I wouldn't want to say that, yes, the child would be absolutely normal, I cannot lie to them. We can improve on the condition. And that is where, a very clear understanding about it would actually help the parent to have a proper expectation of the outcome that they might be getting of either the surgeries which are possible or which are required, or the therapy as well. A lot of improvement can happen. But can the lesion in the brain, be taken off? Probably no. And thus, there would be some amount of difficulty that the child would face. Our goal would be mostly to make sure that the child improves to the maximum possible extent for that particular child. So this understanding would help enable them to accept the child's condition. And what Priya said, that the moment we tell the child might need crutches or the child might have to be on wheelchair, we really need to understand, is it stopping the child or is it making the child little more independent?
Lights better. True. And I feel parental communication because most therapists end up working with any child for a considerable amount of time, right? Maybe a kid is with me till he starts walking and then, goes to somebody else for the next set of milestones. I feel it's very important that we as therapists are able to explain what we are seeing to the parent in the most simplest yet the most perfect way, so that they understand what we are doing on the child, and at the same time break down interventions in a way that they understand and they can do some carryover work with them at home, so that your work is supported by their efforts at home, because at the end of the day they spend more time with the child.
Absolutely. And also another thing that I would want to add is, as parents, they do go through a lot of stress themselves. So, from time to time, for the parents to deal with these stresses that they often encounter, starting from the feeding issues to moving the child when the child grows up, carrying the child, it can be physically as well as mentally strenuous for them, for the parents. So addressing these are also very important. So, I have seen a child who was 15 years old and he had come post-surgery. He had to be on wheelchair. He was a 15-year-old boy. And prior to that, the parents were actually carrying the child. Imagine the load which comes on the parent, that of carrying at least a 40-kilo weight throughout the day. It's beyond imagination. So even in that aspect, probably, giving a wheelchair to the child is also healthier for you. Yes, there would be challenges. There would be need to describe people who are asking you questions. And that is where you stand by your child. So when you are convinced, you will be able to convince others. And even if you're not be able to convince others, you really don't need to, because it is your child.
Your child. So
And it is your responsibility. So if you are giving the happiness to them, so that matters the most, more than what people think.
In fact, these actually come up when we introduce, alternative augmentative communication systems to children. Because, these children have to use systems like either PECs, where they exchange pictures to communicate, or write out a sentence, or they use high-tech devices where they have to either through eye scanning method or through pointing. There's something that's happening that is not a verbal communication, right? So even that carries a lot of stigma around it. Again, because of two reasons. Again, the acceptance from parents is that my child has to speak when the child is going to speech therapy. So that's mostly the expectation from speech therapy, okay? But as speech therapists, what we do is we help with communication. We are not just going to tell that this child is going to speak this way and this child is going to have, these verbal expressions coming out. So, there is a lot of talk that needs to happen around various other modes of communication and how these should be accepted. And, as members of the society, we also have the social responsibility to sort of address questions that come randomly, even with our relatives and friends that probably see a child on a wheelchair or feel sorry for them or say, oh, this and that. So we need to also have this discussion where we sort of tell them that they don't have, what you think as a miserable life. They have certain equipments that they're using to help them cope with the challenges that they have, right? So we also have a responsibility to sensitize people around this.
That is amazing, actually. I knew that when we were planning this panel discussion, that it will be very hard to end it. And I feel it's also because there are so many aspects, right? Like each one of us approaches cerebral palsy in a different way, given what we are pursuing as a clinical goal, and our lacunae in understanding our patient. And then we are filling each other's gaps. And I realize that it's a really vast topic, but I feel primarily it was important to put together something like this so that parents know that every problem that you see in the child can have a solution with some specialist who is specialized in dealing with those. So I think that was one of the primary reasons of putting together a panel discussion. We just wanted it to be very informal, where we are having conversations as professionals about knowing each other's work more. And if it benefits an audience where that such information is required, I think we are more than happy to share everything that we know. So I am going to, it's already 9 o'clock, so I think we should wrap up the panel discussion. I do have a few questions that a few parents have asked and a few panel members, participants have asked. So given based, if we have discussed them, I will pop it out, and anybody who feels they can answer it, they can go ahead. So one of the parent asks, what is the right time to go for speech therapy? I think we have already established as early as possible. If you think the child needs communication help, I think it's important that we pursue it. So I think that's something that we have answered. He also asked something that we had mentioned, and I think Archana, in the end, I would want you to sum up. If first of all, finding places that caters to all the aspects that the child needs, that's always a challenge. One center that has everything. I know such centers do exist, but again, quality of care can be very different. Seniority of the therapists working with the child can be different. So I think a lot of aspects come into play there. And they also talk about the finances of therapies, taking the child for therapy, and what best can be done at home. So would anyone like to take this? Home-based interventions and how to make the most out of it.
I think like we started off PROE rehab, we should look at team consultations, and we should look at concessions in terms of supporting the financial conditions of the family. And to be very honest, this is a beautiful platform to reach people from every corner of the country. And since we have speakers, people who speak different languages, and we also know most of the languages that that are being used in the country, I think it is good to have that accessibility and to have an online team as an alternative. Of course, getting physical therapies done is what parents would prefer, because there is something that the therapist does, and you can probably go back and mimic. But on a personal experience, I feel the onus of the child's progress lies in the parents' hands eventually. So in my online interactions, I have felt that there is more, involvement from the parent side as compared to direct therapies. Okay, so I feel parents do learn more and are more aware and do have a better empathy level for their child, and are even able to have conversations with people around them and say, what, my child is taking therapies and he or she is doing this and we are working on these things, because they are hands-on working with their children. I think this could be a future of rehabilitation, because we have to work as teams. And as sad as it is, a lot of parents do get this recommendation that they should wait and see until the child is 4 or 5 for them to speak. Unfortunately, most of this information comes from doctors, and this is a sad reality, but it has to be addressed. I think we as professionals should also make sure that doctors are on board with the kind of work that we are doing, and what kind of referrals they can have with us. I think we should shed all barriers and come together, for children with developmental challenges, for that matter.
A parent asks if a CP diagnosed child can lead a normal life as others with proper intervention. Of course, I also feel it also depends on the severity. Like if the child achieves mobility very early, and then we are just addressing quality of that mobility, and then of course followed up by speech and cognitive challenges. So I think step by step, it is very easy for us to integrate the child. Now, normalcy, I think, is a very tricky word, right? The definition is so different. What you consider normal might not be considered normal by me. So I think that's a very subjective thing. But I think the child can be pushed to achieve the maximum potential based on the severity of the presentation. So that is my opinion on CP children leading a so-called normal life. I do feel all of us are a little abnormal in our own ways, but that's just a philosophical thing. Any other opinions on that?
Right. So I would just want to add, as you rightly said, that normalcy is something. There's no proper definition to that. Normalcy is what we have created. What majority of the population, the way majority of the population is living a life, we call it normal. But they haven't complained that they're having some difficulty. We know that they have some difficulties, some constraints that they are facing. We need to focus on how to make sure that those constraints are taken care of. But our normal may not be normal also. So if they are fine, they're leading a happy life, they're reaching their maximum potential, that is normal for them. And the faster we, let this get inside our own mind, it becomes easier for the parents, for the kids as well, because we won't be, always be upset and pushing them to go through that normal, what we think it is as normal.
Okay, so I think with that, a lot of the questions, sorry,
functional, and they should be able to take part in any community-based activities that they are supposed to. That's it. I think making them more independent and functional is the ultimate goal.
So true.
So it doesn't matter. We don't have to compare them with someone else.
Yes,
obviously,
absolutely.
if I have to answer that, I will say that it depends on so many factors. Seriously, depends on how many therapies you're taking. I'm serious about it.
True.
See, there are
It is
n number
true.
of therapies available nowadays. You're giving a child a particular different environment to grow, to engage. So in the end, it varies what you're giving to the child. If you're giving that kind of environment to the child at home, it doesn't matter then. He or she is going to achieve those goals ultimately.
I was going through one study actually, and there they were trying to understand the clinical outcomes of cerebral palsy in various societies. So even in a state, in a country like the United States, where say access to therapy is covered under insurance, so more and more parents, there's more awareness in general. There are states where since the policies are a little strict, I would say the rate at which the child progresses in a few of those states is much worse actually than some of the progress levels in India. So, I mean, I think the comparison is really about intervention. The harder you push the child, the more you are able to achieve, especially in the early years. I think that really determines the future. I don't think there is any sugarcoating this. You just have to push the child. There is just I think at the risk of sounding very barbaric, it's just how it is, right? Unless we are able to get the most clinical outcomes in the shortest period of time, I think the longevity of those clinical outcomes becoming behaviors increases.
Yes.
If we attain walking at 8 and 9, what I have seen is children do them, not just like it's a little harder to convert that into a behavior because the child is used to not moving, so then of course they will walk, they have attained walking, but then it comes at a very lethargic presentation, and they're not always willing because it takes a toll on them. So I think again, emphasis in cerebral palsy is all about early intervention, inclusion, and I think just more and more parental participation and awareness. I think if anything has come out of our discussion today, it's primarily emphasis on these things. And of course, knowing that there are so many specialists now who are capable of addressing a lot of your child's issues. And if you are in the right place, and if you have access, I think you can do a lot more for the child than what he or she is getting right now. So I think on that note, I think I will wind up the panel discussion. It was great. I think we could have spoken for another hour and we wouldn't have stopped, but it's just how it is. It's so vast, and because of the nature of our work, it's something that you take home, right? I don't think we leave our kids at the clinic. We take them home and we're constantly thinking about them. So it's great to be in this team with you guys. I think every time we are able to do something like this together, it's just amazing.
I think we all agree to
Same here, Priya. Thank you for hosting this again. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the parents and others who had joined.
I think it was pretty late actually. And the fact that a lot of them stuck around on a Saturday evening when they could have been doing other things, I think it was great. So we are going to edit this and probably put snippets, and probably the whole recording can be made available on YouTube, so that parents can watch it at a more leisurely pace. So having said that, have a great week and a year, and I hope there's no more pandemic. And I hope we are able to regroup more frequently. And take care, guys. Good night.
Thank you so much
for this
Thank you so
session.
much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.